using stories to teach complex legal concepts. After several months of teaching, Sarah noticed something that surprised her. Students rarely approached her after class to talk about a statute or a legal definition. Instead, they would smile and say things like, "I keep thinking about that buyer you told us about," or "I'll never forget the inspection story from today's class." At first, she thought it was simply because the stories were entertaining. When she mentioned it to David, he smiled. "It isn't the stories they remember," he said. "It's the lesson inside the story." He explained that people have been learning through storytelling for thousands of years. Long before there were textbooks, PowerPoint presentations, or online learning platforms, important lessons were passed from one generation to the next through stories. Today, educational research continues to support what great instructors have always known. When information is connected to people, situations, and emotions, students are far more likely to remember it. Think about your own real estate career. You probably don't remember every statute you studied while preparing for your licensing exam, but chances are you vividly remember your first difficult transaction, your first inspection surprise, or the first time a contract nearly fell apart at the closing table. Those experiences stayed with you because they created a story. As instructors, we have the opportunity to give our students those same memorable learning experiences without requiring them to make costly mistakes themselves. David challenged Sarah during one of her classes. Instead of beginning with the legal definition of material fact, he suggested she begin with a family preparing to sell their Arizona home. The family knew that the roof leaked during heavy monsoon storms. They painted the ceiling. They never mentioned the problem. Several months after closing, the new owner discovered extensive water damage. Sarah asked the class a simple question. "What do you think happened next?" Immediately, hands went up around the room. Students began discussing disclosure obligations, inspections, ethics, and potential legal consequences before Sarah had even introduced the statute. By the time she explained Arizona's disclosure requirements, students weren't memorizing legal language. They were applying the law to a situation they already understood. That's the power of storytelling. A well-told story creates curiosity before providing answers. Instead of asking students to memorize legal concepts in isolation, it gives those concepts a purpose. Students naturally become invested because they want to know how the situation ends. Stories are especially effective when teaching complex legal material. Topics such as agency, contracts, disclosures, fair housing, and commissioner standards can sometimes feel overwhelming when presented only as legal requirements. However, when those same concepts are introduced through realistic Arizona transaction scenarios, students quickly recognize why the law exists and how it protects both consumers and licensees. Case studies work particularly well because they encourage students to think like real estate professionals instead of simply recalling information. Rather than telling students what happened, ask them to analyze the situation first. What would you advise your client? What options does the broker have? How could this complaint have been prevented? Questions like these transform students from passive listeners into active problem solvers. They begin applying the law instead of simply reading about it. Of course, storytelling should always support the lesson rather than distract from it. Sarah remembered attending a class years earlier where the instructor spent nearly 20 minutes telling a funny transaction story. Everyone laughed, but by the end of the story, no one could remember why it had been shared. David often reminded her, never tell a story unless you know exactly what you want students to learn from it. Every story should have a clear educational purpose. Sometimes that purpose is demonstrating best practices. Other times, it's showing how a misunderstanding led to an ADRE complaint, a lawsuit, or an ethical violation. Those cautionary stories are often among the most memorable because they help students recognize mistakes before making them themselves. They also remind students that real estate decisions have real consequences for buyers, sellers, brokers, and the public. At the same time, instructors should resist the temptation to make stories unnecessarily complicated. Adding too many characters, dates, side conversations, or unrelated details often causes students to lose sight of the lesson. The strongest stories are usually the simplest. They introduce a realistic situation, present a challenge, encourage students to think through the problem, and conclude with the legal principle or professional practice being taught. As Sarah became more comfortable using stories, something remarkable happened. Students stopped asking, "Will this be on the test?" Instead, they asked, "What would happen if this occurred during one of my transactions?" David smiled when she shared that observation. That's when you know real learning is taking place. He was right. The goal of teaching isn't simply to help students pass an exam. It's to prepare them for situations they'll encounter throughout their careers. Stories bridge the gap between the classroom and the real world by helping students visualize how legal concepts apply during actual transactions. Long after students forget individual slides or definitions, they'll often remember the stories. And because they remember the stories, they'll remember the lessons that came with them. Instructor tip: whenever you introduce a new legal concept, ask yourself, can I teach this through a realistic Arizona transaction? If the answer is yes, you found an opportunity to create a lesson students are far more likely to remember. Question 1. Why are stories often more memorable than simply presenting legal definitions? Answer: stories connect legal concepts to realistic situations, making information more meaningful and easier to remember. They help students understand not only what the law says, but why it matters and how it applies during actual real estate transactions. Question 2. How can case studies improve classroom participation? Answer: case studies encourage students to analyze situations, discuss possible solutions, and apply legal principles rather than simply recalling information. This active involvement strengthens critical thinking and long-term retention. Question 3. What makes an effective instructional story? Answer: an effective instructional story is realistic, directly supports the lesson objective, remains focused on the learning outcome, and clearly demonstrates how a legal or professional concept applies in the real world, without unnecessary details that distract from the message.